Hi, and welcome back to the Histories Inc. podcast. Thanks for listening. In this 11th episode of the podcast, I'll be discussing an event that happened in Perth, the city where I live, that transformed Scotland in a number of profound ways. That is the riots that kick-started the Scottish Protestant Reformation. The 11th of May is a date with considerable historical significance for the city of Perth in Scotland. On this day, in 1559, a large crowd went on a 2-day rampage through the city, in particular emptying and then pulling down 4 ancient monasteries and religious houses. They were fired up by the words of the Reformist preacher, John Knox, himself very recently returned to Scotland from exile in John Calvin's Geneva. It's widely held that the sermon Knox preached in the Church of St. John's in the centre of Perth on the morning of 11th of May was the prime motivation for the ensuing events. This riotous rampage wasn't random. It was directed against the sights of the international social elite of the time. These were the wealthy religious orders of the dominant Catholic Church: the Dominicans, known as the Black Friars, Franciscans, known as Grey Friars, the Carmelites, who were White Friars, and the Carthusians. These religious organizations, that were spread through many different countries, were large-scale landowners and politically well-connected. They oiled the machinery of many European governments, contributed in large part to the elitist universities, and connected the ruling powers of the rival and often warring states of Catholic Christendom. But these religious orders were also very out of touch with the societies in which they worked and preached, and were almost universally despised by the masses in Scotland. In many respects, they were the one-percenters, the bankers and tax avoiders of the 16th century. And so, after several years of political and religious tension in Scotland, the return of John Knox to his home country in 1559 proved to be the spark that united wild fires of resentment against the Church, and in particular the representatives of the Church in these religious houses. According to Knox's own later account of the events of the 11th of May 1559, the riots began in St. John's Kirk, when resentment against one of the priests led to the crowd turning and destroying the church's altars, what he called the tabernacle and all the other monuments of idolatry. Thus, according to Knox, when what was happening in St. John's became known about through the town, to quote him, the whole multitude came together, not the gentlemen or those that were earnest professors of the faith, but the rascal multitude. Finding nothing to do in that church, that's St. John's, these ran without deliberation to the Grey and Black Friars, and notwithstanding that these monasteries had within them very strong guards for their defence, their gates were forthwith burst open. Idolatry was the occasion of the first outburst, but thereafter the common people began to look for spoil. Such spoil or plunder was indeed what this riotous crowd found in the places they went on to attack. Knox singled out the Franciscans in particular as living in luxurious wealth. In very deed, he said, the Grey Friars' house was so well provided that unless honest men had seen it, we would have feared to report what provision they had. Their sheets, blankets, beds, and coverlets were such that no earl in Scotland had better. This contrasted a little with other religious houses such as the Dominicans, which Knox noted did not have a like abundance, although he also said, and yet there was more than became men professing poverty. Within a short time, the contents of these wealthy religious houses were taken away by the crowd. One could call it a looting spree, alongside wholesale destruction of the main part of each of the buildings. He says again, the poor were permitted to take the spoil, but no honest man was enriched by the value of a groat. For the preachers had before threatened all men, that for covetousness' sake none should put their hand to such a reformation. So had men's consciences before been beaten by the word, that they had no respect to their own particular profit, but only to abolish idolatry and the places and monuments thereof. In this they were so busy and so laborious that within 2 days these 3 great places, monuments of idolatry to wit, the monasteries of the Grey and Black Thieves and that of the Charterhouse monks, a building of a wondrous cost and greatness, was so destroyed that only the walls remained. This reformation and destruction of the Kirks of Perth was the start of a revolution in Scotland. The reformers went on to empty and dismantle religious houses across many towns and cities of Scotland, including Cooper, St Andrews, Aberdeen, Stirling and Edinburgh. In many respects, this was one of many conflicts in Scotland between the nobility and the current ruler, in this case the Queen Regent, Marie of Guise, widow of King James V. But it was very different, inasmuch as it took on a much greater ideological and political significance for what was achieved by those who led the conflict. Within just over a year, Marie was gone, and the Catholic order was replaced by the Protestantism of the Reformers. It was a transformation of Scottish society that created widespread social reform on the basis of religion, including new ways of providing for the poor and needy, such as the creation of new hospitals and poorhouses, and a programme of education to encourage universal literacy for the sake of enabling all people to read the English language Bible. The revolution of the Scottish Protestant Reformation was to have later echoes in the struggles of the Civil War, the War of the Three Kingdoms in the 17th century that saw King Charles I deposed by religiously inspired reformers. Indeed, it is also one of the historical precedents of the American Revolutionary War against the British in the 1770s. It was seen as the righteous struggle of the downtrodden against an unjust and greedy political class. In fact, the Scottish Protestant Reformation was many things as well as this. It was inspired by preachers such as John Knox and others such as Paul Methin, but it was carried forward and became politically successful, because many in the Scottish nobility took advantage of the upsurge of anti-church sentiment. These lords of the congregation, such as James Stewart and James Douglas Earl of Morton, astutely read their personal political advantage if they sided with the reformers rather than the traditionalist Catholics, even if that did put them in direct conflict with the monarchy in the form of the Queen Regent. And the other significant dimension of this revolution was that it played out wider international conflicts in the context of Scotland. The power of the monarchy was largely supported by the French Catholic powers. The underage Queen, Mary Stuart, famously known as Mary Queen of Scots, was at this point in France, married to the French Dauphin and expecting one day to become Queen of France. Her French mother, Marie of Guise, was, as we've seen, the Queen Regent in Scotland, ruling in her place, at least until Queen Mary came of age. French money and troops helped to maintain order and stability, and it was against French troops that the reformers found themselves fighting. On the other hand, the English monarchy had recently swung back to Protestantism, with the accession of Queen Elizabeth in late 1558. And it was a series of English interventions that enabled the reformers to carry through and win the revolution that they started. This came in the form of covert help and also through direct and open interventions. Elizabeth and her advisers clearly wished to have a Protestant Scottish political system, one that was as free as possible from French Catholic influence. In many respects, this set the stage for the later chaos that ensued with the return to Scotland and eventual abdication of Queen Mary a few years later. And so within this wider context, we can return again to this large group of angry people who rampaged through the streets of Perth on the 11th of May 1559. This crowd, this mob, pulled down large religious houses, chapels, cloisters and chapter houses. They destroyed the tombs of former monarchs such as James I and Margaret Tudor, and they took what they could from the wealth and luxury of monks and friars. Knox used the phrase rascal multitude to describe this mob. He initially talked to them as the whole multitude coming together, but distinguishing them from the gentlemen, the wealthy, educated landowners, and also the earnest professors, those who were at the forefront of preaching and professing the new Protestant religion. And we should be careful to note that this large crowd wasn't necessarily the people of Perth, or not only them. There are contemporary accounts that a large group numbering several thousand followed Knox and the other reformists to Perth, coming from Dundee and the east coast of Scotland. This wasn't an army, it wasn't disciplined. It was a group of supporters, perhaps loyal to their leaders and to the idea of Reformation. They were a large group, angry with the privilege and wealth of the Church and its elitist organisations. In Perth in May 1559, the rascal multitude certainly rampaged and caused significant destruction. 4 building complexes were destroyed, their communities were driven out, and their possessions largely taken. Although in all cases the monks and friars were allowed to take what they could carry. As Knox said, no honest men were enriched by a single groat. However, Knox didn't comment on those dishonest members of the crowd who almost certainly benefited from the looting. Indeed, Knox's account was written as propaganda. It was meant as a representation of the good things for him of what happened during the Reformation in Scotland. Despite this destruction, this was not at this point a bloody Reformation. There are no accounts of deaths or even injuries during the 2 days of rioting. The rascal multitude were largely peaceful in their treatment of the friars and monks. Some of the crowd most likely had reasons to wish for revenge, to settle old scores. After all, tensions in Perth between the Franciscans in particular and some of the particularly artisan townspeople had resulted in the execution in 1544 of the 6 Perth martyrs for various religious offences, interrupting sermons, mocking priests, failing to call on the name of the Virgin Mary during childbirth. The Grey Friars were the first religious house to be attacked, but the crowd, the rascal multitude, destroyed only property, not the people themselves. In most social contexts, particularly during times of change and stress, such scores are often settled if the opportunity is given. A rioting rascal multitude is the perfect such opportunity, but this doesn't appear to have been an issue at this time, at least. Although again, we must caution that we rely on the account given by Knox, an outsider to the situation in most respects, and the one person with the greatest interest in presenting us with a velvet, peaceful revolution. And in this context, we can ask in particular, what did he mean by labelling the agents of this uprising as the rascal multitude? The term conveys both populist and positive fervour, alongside the negative, destructive and uncontrolled power that is a fearful thing for political and religious leaders. In all likelihood, Knox and the lords of the congregation didn't intend their velvet Protestant Reformation to start in this way. With hindsight, in the end, we can see they were successful, and so their version of history tells us it came about because of the rascal multitude rather than a mindless mob. But for anyone in power, such a rascal multitude is a dangerous beast to try to tame. In one final footnote to this reflection on the Perth riots of May 1559, one of the lesser-known casualties of these events was David Cameron. According to the records of the Blackfriars Dominican monastery in Perth at the time of the Protestant Reformation, this was the name of their prior. That is, David Cameron, O.P., Order of Preachers. In the days following the 11th of May, Cameron saw his religious house plundered and destroyed, leaving him without a home and an occupation in a new Scotland, where his religion and way of life were no longer respected or sustained. Some of the friars from the religious houses moved with the times and the new politics, and embraced the new religion of Knox, becoming preachers and ministers in the new Kirk. Others retained their old ways and moved to less wealthy religious communities in Scotland, or left the country to remain in their order in more supportive Catholic countries. However, David Cameron appears to have disappeared without a trace in the wake of the revolution of the 11th of May. With some irony, we can say perhaps that the rascal multitude does give us some hope at least. So, thanks for listening today. As usual, if you want to find out more about this topic in the podcast series, then there are more details on the podcast website, which is at histories-inc.com. And if you like this Histories Inc. podcast, and you're in a position where you'd like to give some small support to it, then you can also pledge a small donation to help me with the running costs through the Patreon website. That's patreon.com/MalloryNye. Patreon is Patreon. And of course, if you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, don't forget to subscribe for free to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. And if you like the podcast, then do please leave a review. It helps other people to find the podcast. That's all for today. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.